So the story of Tiger Rock gives us confirmed proof that there is indeed an interlinking between the stories of the Tales from the Pizzaplex series, and that these stories do in fact fit into some form of timeline. Now, the story has our protagonist Kai, and during the story he visits the Pizzaplex. We see that there is a blacklight arena which is underneath the castle-like theatre at the centre of the Pizzaplex, and there are go-karts, a roller coaster and climbing tubes which also link around the facility. We also see that Gator Golf exists at this time. Now, the main event that we see here is that the storyteller tree from the storyteller does exist, and it has closed down due to what is reported as a glitch and has only been up for 3 weeks. And so we can confirm that this story does in fact appear to happen not long after the events of the storyteller. We also learn that the Pizzaplex is supposedly shaped like a pizza and the venues sit on the edges of the pie. We also find that the AR booth is apparently located on the opposite side of the Pizzaplex from the tree. Now, one thing that is interesting in this story is that it is supposedly the AR booth which Kai enters. However, there is a confusing thing that happens throughout the story where AR constantly gets mixed up with VR when it is written in the story. Now, there is an exhibit on within the AR booth which is 10 years in the future of the Pizzaplex, and apparently in the 10-year future there is also a log flume ride, which is the only time that we have ever seen mention of a log flume outside of Ruin, where we see that there is a decommissioned log flume which is built on what would have been Roxy Raceway, so presumably the raceway was built over the log flume ride for some reason. Now, as we know, the Mimic 1 code was used for the Storyteller tree, which has now infected all of the Pizzaplex's attractions. We find that it is also within the AR booth in the form of Tiger Rock, who is easily able to adapt and learn languages such as Hawaiian, which it picks up from Kai, and it also seems to be the same Mimic program from the Mimic, which is currently buried in the basement of the Pizzaplex, as it keeps attempting to tug on Kai's arms in an attempt to pull them off. Also, side note, in the future there is a little helper bot which is named Henry, which I find kind of funny considering Henry in this series and the fact that Helpy is also in this series, so maybe there's some kind of connection there. Tiger Rock would also reveal to us that the Mimic learned hide and seek a long time ago, and whether it learnt this in the Freddy's establishment as part of the theory about what Afton did to kill the kids is unknown, but it is possible that it learned it from what we see in the Mimic story, where the recovery crews sent by Fazbear's are hunted down by it and basically in some kind of game of hide and seek. On multiple occasions Kai appears to escape from the AR booth, however it is never actually at any point in the story confirmed that he did so, as we do not ever actually see him remove the headset. And although yes, at one point we do in fact see a whirlpool of colour which then shows him inside the AR booth, and during this time he does see Astrid from Nexie along with her grandpa and the disfigured doll outside of the AR booth, this could just be the Mimic using the real world situation to manipulate him, as this is basically showing us how the AR system works in Ruin. It messes with your head, it creates false illusions in reality, and it does make sense that Kai never in fact did escape from the network, as we do see at the end, even though he believes that he is in actual fact outside of the system, although he can never be sure, Tiger Rock shows up randomly, and we know he's not a physical being in the real world, so this means that Kai is still in the network, and Tiger Rock follows the Mimic 1 programming and rips off his arms. Story number 2, The Monty Within, gives us our character Kane, who visits the Pizzaplex, and it is noted to be 6 weeks to graduation, placing this around the springtime of whatever year it is set in. Now, it would appear that this story goes in some way to explaining what actually happens with regards to Vanny and Vanessa and how they control the body that they inhabit, as we learn that the left brain is basically an onboard computer, and the right brain contains our consciousness, and it is shown that it acts independently and does not know what the onboard Siri is doing, so basically they exist as two separate entities within the brain, just like how Vanny takes control of Vanessa and presumably does things without her realising, and so Vanessa, after learning of this, figures out a way to do the same thing against Vanny in order to combat her. Now, when Kane visits the arcade in the Pizzaplex, we discover that there are statues of Roxy, implying that she is already in use as a character, and we also hear that Glamrock, Chica and Monty are part of the band, and so we know that this already is after Bonnie was replaced by Monty. We also find that the arcade has a new game, which is called the Fazcade Tag Team, and you basically have an AI partner within the game who learns how to mimic your moves, and this should set off alarm bells already, as mimicry is already something that we are heavily wary of within this franchise. The fact that there is also a mysterious light on the ceiling above the game, which appears to only affect Kane and install the AI into himself, tells us that this is showing that the mimic, or at least some form of program, is indeed being utilised by the game in order to implant this in Kane's head. And so this would likely dictate to us that this story must therefore presumably occur after the mimic infects all of the systems in the Pizzaplex, as if it is indeed the mimic taking over Kane, then it would make sense that it cannot do this until it has been released into the system by the storyteller tree. The way that this manifests appears to be strange, as we see that there are voices within his head which basically act like impulses, and also that it occasionally takes control of his limbs. Now, from what we see with Vanessa, this does not appear to be how the mimic operates, and we see that Kane does appear to be researching this very phenomena at the time, and as we see with most of the stories in the books, this may not actually be being caused by the mimic or anything of supernatural, but in fact may actually be Kane's guilty conscience making him act out in this way. We also get two interesting notes within this story that reveal to us that a Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator game does in fact exist in canon in the universe of the games. However, we do not know certain is what exactly is the specifics of this game. We know that the simulator exists and that it features Orville Elephant. However, we have no other information on the game, and so we cannot presume that the actual FNAF 6 Pizzeria Simulator game in its entirety is in fact canon. It is also revealed to us that 1 year before, Kane had a date at an old Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria location, which then shut down within the year. Now this is curious because we know up until Help Wanted that Freddy's was basically redundant as a company. There would have been no sites, so for this site to have existed for the lifetime of the Pizzaplex implies that after Help Wanted brought back the company's reputation, there may have actually been other Freddy sites which were opened around, which then eventually closed as the company merged into creating the Pizzaplex as their main attraction. The third and final story of the book, which is Bleeding Heart, takes place in the winter time in the lead up to Christmas in a town called Marston, which features a Bayer high school, and as far as I have been able to discover from researching, this is completely fictional as a location. There is not one that I can find, and certainly not anywhere around where the Pizzaplex is presumably located in real life. There is references to similar named towns and high schools in California, but we cannot presume that this is the same Pizzaplex. During the story, our protagonist would visit the Mega Pizzaplex, and we would discover that at this point in time, the Gator Golf, Fazoblast, the Fazcade and Roxy Raceway are all noted to exist, and there are also railings on the upper floors, and we see Freddy, Chica, Roxy and Monty, which imply that this is indeed very close to the time of security breach, as the description of the site seems to match the one in the game. Now at this point it is shown that the Pizzaplex is utilising nanobots in order to have some form of attraction, which shows how presents are magically cut and wrapped. Now we do see that there are different kinds of nanite. There are those that cut the paper for the wrapping, and there are ones which print ink onto objects. And our protagonist is a bit of an idiot and manages to steal the wrong ones. For instead of picking ones up which create ink, which he plans to use to tattoo himself, he in actual fact manages to steal the ones that cut. And so the story basically has a long-winded way of showing us that every time that he wants to have a new tattoo, then the nanobots instead cut that drawing out of his flesh, removing chunks of him as they go. And eventually he makes the mistake of, in the heat of the moment, saying he wants every single design in a book out of spite, and then the nanites get to work and start carving up his body to create all of those drawings, leaving literally nothing remaining of him but his heart. B7-2 would reveal to us that Billy in actual fact survives his encounter with the car compressor device and is recovering in the hospital, where the doctors have managed to retrieve most of his animatronic adaptions and remove them from his body, and it is discovered that these were not as extensive as Billy first thought, enabling him to become more or less normal again. However, the hospital has retained these items for inspection, and it appears that they contain some form of remnant, as they continuously call out to Billy in the hospital, and then later we see that they actually hunt him down in order to recombine with him. At first it appears that this is actually just some form of hallucination, however later we do find that it is indeed an actual thing, as Billy's grandmother later tricks the mechanical parts into merging with her instead of Billy, and then once it is trapped within her, she reveals that she is in actual fact dying, and so plans to take it with her in order to give Billy a better life. There is notably a black oil that is mentioned to come from Billy's parts, which does remind us of how in certain stories throughout the Pizzaplex novels that there is mention to black blood in relation to remnant entities, as we see most prominently in Animatronic Apocalypse, where the principal appears to bleed black oil when stabbed, which is also something that we see in the Mimic Stingers. And as I believe that it was in actual fact the Mimic virus that corrupted Billy in the first place, it is entirely possible that these remnant parts that were extracted from him may in actual be part of the remnant of the Mimic, which has somehow survived and is now out hunting for a new body. Together Forever shows us the life of a boy named Travis, who in actual fact is a ghost and does not even realise that he is dead, and is stuck in a loop of doing certain things up until the moment of his death. And we do find that certain key points within this story would actually point towards the fact that Travis died at some point around the time of security breach, it would seem, as Sun is featured very prominently in the story and is implied to have been around for years at this point. However, as Sun was technically around since the beginning of the Pizzaplex, or even before that, as an animatronic performer in the theatre, it is notable that Sun is more widely known by this point in the story, and Travis also mentions that the Pizzaplex has been open for 2 years, and interestingly enough, the wording around this quote seems to imply that this is the reopened Pizzaplex following whatever catastrophe we saw in Lally's game, which led to it being remodelled into the security breach version. Dittophobia is by far the most controversial of all the Pizzaplex stories that we have gotten. And as we see, it shows us that a boy named Rory, who was only 7 years old, was apparently taken by what we can presume, based on the description of the voice on the tape, to be Afton. He was placed in a bunker, which is basically the FNAF 4 gameplay. The details are very, very exact throughout this story. There is so much detail poured onto the description of the bedroom and its surrounding areas that we cannot, in any logical aspect, confirm that this is definitely not the FNAF 4 room that we see. So the FNAF 4 rooms that we see on the breaker map of Sister Location does exist in that bunker, and so it would appear that the house that the Aftons had Mike grow up in, that had this room in it, has been replicated perhaps into, and so we see that the FNAF 4 room is not actually a room from the Afton household, but it is a mock-up room which has been put into the bunker. And based on what we know of Mike's history so far in this series, I'm going to conclude that Mike indeed did spend some points of time in that room, and that's why he has memories of it. We also discover that this bunker in actual fact utilises a hallucinogenic gas as a means of manipulating people's minds of their environment, which is interesting because that basically adds on to the list of things that Afton has been using in this bunker in order to fool people's minds, such as the illusion discs. And so we see that because the hallucinogenic gas has been going and Afton is no longer around shortly after Rory is placed in the bunker, Rory has been reliving the FNAF 4 gameplay for 10 years. He is now 17 and the environment all around him is exactly how it started 10 years ago in his mind because of the gas. As when the gas fails, we see that the whole place has deteriorated and he is basically surviving on ration wafers out of a fridge. And we get confirmation that this is indeed the Sister Location bunker, as when Rory gets out of the small area that is the fake house, he ends up in other areas which are definitely, based on the description, the Sister Location bunker rooms, where we see Ballora and the Funtime Gallery. So this would show us that at some point prior to the Sister Location being opened, that Afton was using this site for experimentation, perhaps with kidnapped kids, as we see in Rory's case. And what is more interesting is that this is definitely not an active site at the time, as when Rory tries to escape through the elevator, there is no power to the building, so this place is not actually in operation. And in actual fact, it may be that Rory's attempts to communicate via walkie-talkie with the outside world are what ends up causing the place to be rediscovered and subsequently reopened. As we know that at some point Rory must have been found before the Sister Location that we see in the game, as if this whole site has been discovered, it's obviously people are going to have discovered that Rory was in there, so it's left unclear whether Rory actually ends up surviving after this story. The mimicked stingers from the Tales of a Pizzaplex series would reveal to us how the mimic endoskeleton manages to go from its arrival at the site of the Pizzaplex to becoming trapped underneath there until it is rediscovered later in Security Breach. As a construction crew is laying the foundations for the Pizzaplex, we discover that they have found the remnants of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place under the foundations, and they are planning on turning it into a sort of museum which would sit beneath the Pizzaplex's basement. However, we find that this site does indeed seem to not have suffered from the fire damage that it was implied to have suffered at the end of FNAF 6. And so, based on the burner rooms that we know exist underneath, it is entirely possible that the burning of the endoskeletons from the FNAF 6 ending were in actual fact taking place in sealed environments within the walls of the site, and the whole thing itself did not actually burn down. While they are building, the Pizzaplex receives a delivery of new animatronics, which are implied to potentially be the band for the site, and we see that the guitarist of this band is described as being horrifying to look at and is a 7-foot tall, horrific metallic endoskeleton. and we see that the endoskeleton appears to be fire damaged, and its head is new while the rest of its body is noticeably older. It is also noted to feature metal endoskeleton ears of some kind which resemble antennas. It also has very striking orange eyes. Now, Gil is quite put off with the thought of having to pull all of the awkward endoskeletons from the site and dismantle them manually, as it is taking too long and is too extensive, and so he programs this new mimic animatronic with the instructions to rip off their arms and heads and then pile them up in order to clear the place quicker, and it sets about doing this. However, it is never given any proper instructions beyond that, and apparently is not programmed with the laws of robotics from Asimov, as when it runs out of endoskeletons to dismantle, it then turns its attentions onto the human staff and begins massacring them en masse, leading to one of them named Danny managing to flee out the doors, as the rest are completely and utterly savaged by this machine, and tells them to seal up the doors with cement. And it does appear that they manage to do this without it escaping, as the rest of the stingers unfold. Sometime not long after, a group of teenagers would plan to go visit the Pizza Plex site while they are visiting a carnival, and there are apparently stories of an old Fazbear's site which exists underneath the site, which would be the pizza place, and there are also rumours that something happened not long ago that were hush-hush according to the company. After the group of teenagers enters the site, they are soon able to realise that they are in fact not alone within the building, and are also trapped, as most of the entrances have actually been sealed with cement to keep the mimic in, and the vent which they managed to access to get in has now been crushed shut, presumably by the mimic itself, in order to prevent their escape. As the stingers progress, the mimic manages to pick off the teens and shows that it has multiple techniques and tricks within its arsenal that has been learned in order to deal with its victims. And so we see that it does in fact have the capability to use a radio which it has learned from other human beings, and is using this as a technique in order to lure in its victims. As the teens are seeking a way in order to either escape or defeat the mimic, they would also discover that there are actually notes regarding the mimic found in manuals. One note, which is believed to have been from an original Fazbear animatronics creation team, would note that the mimic is programmed to learn by observation, and at some point learned to copy other people. We also learn that mimic endos apparently have a switch on the back of their neck which can be used to deactivate them, which none of the characters so far appear to have been able to exploit as a means of defeating it. And we also discover that the suit is actually apparently capable of expanding and contracting its limbs in order to fit into different suits. As part of what its name suggests, when it mimics things, it truly can mimic things by shaping its body differently. And for some unknown reason that is never actually revealed in the story, the mimic endoskeletons were decommissioned by the company for something that they did, and it is recommended that any that are encountered are to have their power cut off and be dismantled immediately. Although not actually seen within Ruin, after this spider-like form of the mimic then decides to climb inside of a costume which is being worn by a human as a disguise, horrifically and incredibly disgustingly detailed, it destroys her body in the process of climbing in. Like, it basically completely and utterly smushes her until there's absolutely no way that she is indeed alive within that suit. And that leaves us with only one character remaining in the story. Being the only person left, Lucia would then decide that the best way to defeat the mimic would be to destroy all of the other costumes around the facility, leaving it with only the Springlock suit as an option in which to hide in. Despite her attempts to destroy the costumes being futile, the Mimic does show up and she does manage to lure it into the spring suit in order to trap it. And while it is in the suit, she manages to activate the spring locks, which cause it to become trapped within the suit. Interestingly enough, it bleeds the same black oily substance that we see coming from B7's animatronic parts in b7-2, which is also the same oily black substance that comes from animatronic Apocalypse, implying that the Mimic in some way may have connections to Remnant. With the Mimic trapped within the Springlock suit, Lucia is able to deactivate it using the switch on the back of its head, and then is able to freely find her way to escape the facility without being pursued by the Mimic. And eventually she does break through the concrete on one of the windows and is rescued by the construction workers, leaving the fate of the Mimic after this point unknown.